Instead of saying, if Ukraine had kept that nuclear capability, would Russia have invaded? Instead, the question is, what would have happened to Ukraine if it insisted on keeping Soviet nuclear weapons?
That's the voice of Maria Rost Rublee, Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations at Monash University in Australia. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Tom Kalina and Michelle Dover.
Thanks, Lauren, and welcome back to Press the Button. Before we get started, I wanted to share some news. This is my last week working at Ploughshares Fund. I'll save my nostalgia for the last interview that I do that you'll hear next week, but let's just say this is a really bittersweet moment for me. I'll be joining the State Department, so more details to come there, but I've just so enjoyed being on the podcast and I'm really going to miss it. But as I said, we'll save most of that for next week. Tom, what do you have for us on nuclear news?
Well, Michelle, it's great to see you again. And I'm sorry that there's only so many times I'll be able to say that again. And again, I will save my goodbyes for next week, but it has been just a tremendous pleasure doing this podcast with you, and you will be sorely missed, but I'm going to save all that. Nuclear news. Well, the war in Ukraine drags on. As we all know, President Biden, who was in Europe last week, giving multiple speeches in multiple places, caused an outcry when at the end of his speech in Poland, he said that Putin cannot stay in power. This caused quite a stir because it implies a regime change strategy on the part of the administration. You know, we can sympathize with Biden's feelings on this. I think we all want Putin to get out of power about now. But this was not a change in policy. The White House quickly walked back Biden's words and said that Biden does not support regime change in Russia. I can definitely see that this might make things more difficult for Biden to seek a diplomatic path out of this crisis. You just simply can't call for someone's removal from power and then try to actually work with them while they're in power. But we'll just have to see how this plays out. On another front, the nuclear posture review, which was supposed to come out before Ukraine, was then delayed because of Ukraine. According to news reports, Biden has signed off on the nuclear posture review. And disappointingly, but maybe not unsurprisingly, despite his campaign promise, Biden is reportedly going to stick with longstanding U.S. policy on the use of nuclear weapons, in particular, saying that it is the fundamental role of U.S. nuclear weapons to deter nuclear attacks. This leaves open the possibility that U.S. nuclear weapons could be used first in extreme circumstances, such as the response to conventional biological, chemical, or possibly cyber attacks. We had been hoping that Biden would put in a more restrictive nuclear policy, either banning or prohibiting the first use of nuclear weapons or restricting nuclear weapons solely to the deterrence of a nuclear attack against the United States or its allies. So unfortunately, this more permissive nuclear policy means Biden's policy is essentially the same as Putin's, and I would add also Trump's. So rather than isolating Putin's dangerous policies, Biden is essentially matching them. So we'll be discussing more about this in the weeks ahead. And on Iran, really nothing major to report, unfortunately. The talks in Vienna are still stalled. Special Envoy Rob Malley has said that the nuclear deal is not around the corner and is not inevitable. So we remain hopeful, but there's nothing conclusive yet. And Michelle, you will be talking about some of the sticking points in the talks in early warning, correct?
That's correct. I sit down with Esfandyar Batmanghelidj, who is a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, to discuss one particular obstacle that negotiators have encountered, and that is whether to lift the foreign terrorist designation on the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corp. And so we talk about that and what it means.
And then Ploughshares Fund President Emma Belcher sits down with Maria Rost Rublee, an associate professor of politics and international relations at Monash University, to discuss Ukraine, nuclear weapons, the myths surrounding them, including whether Ukraine would have been safer if it had kept the nuclear weapons that it had from Soviet times. It's a great conversation, so please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
As we wait for news on the status of the Iran nuclear negotiations, we've read reports that one of the last hurdles in the process appears to be Iran's demand that the United States remove the foreign terrorist organization designation on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corp. This designation was placed on the IRGC by the Trump administration in April 2019. To help us understand what this all means for the negotiations, we are joined by Esfandyar Batmanghelidj, visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Yar, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Michelle. It's great to be here.
Yar, as you know, we have 7 minutes to tape this week's nuclear and national security news starting now. So we are taping this on Thursday, March 24th. And at this point, we don't know which way the negotiations are going to go. But clearly, this issue has become a major sticking point. What is the foreign terrorist organization designation, and how does it impact Iran and the IRGC?
Sure. So I think the easiest way to think about the foreign terrorist organization designation, we'll call it the FTO designation for short, is that it's a label that the US government applies to different organizations and entities around the world to identify them as a terrorist group or as a group that is supporting terrorist activities. And related to that are a set of legal restrictions about how US persons can engage with those actors. Now, in the case of the IRGC, which was added to the FTO list in 2019 by the Trump administration, this is one of the many ways that the IRGC is identified as a group that either facilitates or engages in terrorism under US law. In addition to the FTO designation, there's another similar designation where the IRGC is identified as a specially designated global terrorist, an SDGT. And then there's a whole host of other sanctions that have been imposed on the IRGC and related entities that stem from activities that the US considers bad actions, whether those are related to terrorism specifically, human rights violations, or non-proliferation.
So what would the US gain by lifting the designation?
Well, if the reports that we're reading are true, and from at least what I understand, it is the case that lifting the FTO designation is one of the final hurdles, if not the final hurdle, in terms of getting an agreement on the restoration of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise known as the Iran nuclear deal. So for over a year now, the US and Iran, in addition to the other parties of the JCPOA, have been engaged in negotiations over how the US is going to re-enter the deal and how Iran is going to come back into compliance with its nuclear commitments under the deal. And one of the sticking points has been, how do you unravel the sanctions that were imposed by the Trump administration when it unilaterally withdrew from the deal in May of 2018? And one of those sanctions that was imposed quite late in the administration's term is the FTO designation. For Iran, this is a sticking point because it feels that this designation is politically important to have lifted. It actually marked the first time that the United States had identified any part of a sovereign government of another country as an FTO. And so it was sort of unusual in that respect. And it was imposed, basically, and we know this from the statements of Trump administration officials, it was imposed even though as a non-nuclear measure, meaning that it relates to the IRGC's terrorism activities, not to activities related to Iran's nuclear program. It was imposed to make the nuclear negotiations more difficult for a future administration by creating this political headache. And so if you imagine the dilemma for Iran's diplomats, they've been engaged in these talks in Vienna. They have had to come up with this formula of concessions that they would make in exchange for concessions that the US would make with regards to sanctions relief. And they need to go back to their leadership in Iran, including senior leaders of the IRGC, which have a major voice in Iran's security establishment, and make the case that this is a good deal, that the terms of this agreement are fair and are in Iran's national interest. And that is a much harder case to make if when they go back to Tehran, The one sanction they haven't been able to get lifted is the one where the IRGC remains, in the view of the US, a foreign terrorist organization.
So you've talked about how this is not the only sanction that the US has placed on the IRGC. What would the ramifications then be if the US lifted the FTO designation?
So this is what's kind of been agonizing about this debate. Even critics of this move concede that there really wouldn't be significant legal ramifications because, as I mentioned, we are not actually debating the US ending its description or identification of the IRGC as a terrorist organization. Another designation, the specially designated global terrorist designation, will remain in place, in addition to a whole host of other sanctions on the IRGC. So we're really only talking about one symbolic label added late in the game in order to derail nuclear diplomacy, and lifting that label or taking away that sanction will get that diplomacy back on track. Aside from the lack of legal ramifications, it's also important to note that, frankly, what we call the IRGC has very little meaningful consequence from a security standpoint on the ground in the Middle East, where US forces are present and where US partners and allies may have concerns. And in fact, the commander of CENTCOM, General McKenzie, made comments to this effect in a recent press availability where he talked about how, from their standpoint, whether or not this label is there or not there, it's not going to change how CENTCOM behaves in that theater, how they engage with the IRGC and the threat that it may or may not pose. And so from a very sort of hard security standpoint, there's also nothing that is going to be lost by lifting this designation. But what we need to remember is that a lot can be gained. So if indeed this is the final hurdle to get the nuclear deal restored, then we are talking about an agreement that subjects Iran to the greatest level of verification and monitoring of any non-proliferation agreement ever devised. It is one that will basically eliminate the proliferation concerns that we have over Iran's civil nuclear program. And it's one that offers this deal and the idea that the US is re-entering the deal after this period of intense escalation between the US and Iran during the Trump administration. It offers a chance at a reset, however limited, but a kind of reset where Iran and the US can engage in some limited dialogue moving forward to address mutual concerns. So if you think about all that there is to gain in a very real, practical sense, the decision should be pretty obvious. But what we're having right now in Washington is a kind of political battle that has a lot more to do with about Biden and his political adversaries than it does about what is in the US national security interest.
Yar, I can't believe how fast 7 minutes goes by. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Hi, my name is Chase Sunwright, and I'm the development coordinator at Ploughshares Fund. I'm also a dedicated listener to Press the Button and an advocate for eliminating nuclear weapons. Whether you're a baby boomer, Gen Xer, millennial, or a member of Generation Z like me, I believe it's crucial that we learn about and speak up on nuclear weapons issues, because nuclear weapons affect all our lives. That's why in-depth discussions on nuclear policy and national security, like the ones on Press the Button, are so important. To help us continue our work and support the podcast, please donate to Ploughshares Fund. Whether it's $5 or $5,000, every last bit helps. We rely on the generosity of supporters and listeners just like you to fund our work to foster the next generation of nuclear scholars and activists and spread the boldest ideas for reducing the global nuclear threat. As we often hear on Press the Button, our work is more crucial than ever. Please help us keep the conversation going by visiting ploughshares.org and donate today.
Maria Rost Rublee is an Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations at Monash University in Australia. Her expertise centres on nuclear politics, constructivism, and diversity in security studies. Maria, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Since the war in Ukraine broke out, there have been arguments circulating that Ukraine would have been safer if it had kept the nuclear weapons that were once on its territory during the Cold War. After Russia invaded Crimea, you wrote a piece, Fantasy Counterfactual, A Nuclear-Armed Ukraine. And it seems this same topic is back in the news today, so I'm thrilled to have you join us. To start, can you tell us about Ukraine's nuclear weapons history?
Yes, absolutely. When the Soviet Union broke apart, Ukraine became the third largest nuclear weapons power in the world behind the US and Russia. They had almost 4,500 warheads. They had almost 200 nuclear missiles that required high levels of technical capability to build. And so they had quite a sophisticated arsenal. They also had nuclear power plants. Of course, an essential component of Ukraine's nuclear history is Chernobyl, the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, which resulted in an explosion and then a meltdown, and radiation spread throughout Europe, which best estimates say around 10,000 people died from the initial blast and radiation spread, and then because of the elevated radiation levels, which caused cancers.
So there's both a nuclear weapons history and the nuclear power component of it. We're seeing both of those issues in the news today again as we see Russia's invasion of Ukraine and all of the consequences. So what is your response to the argument that if Ukraine had kept these weapons that you told us about, it would have been safer? What do you say to that?
Well, it's a fantasy. And the question shows a lack of knowledge about Ukrainians' nuclear weapons expertise. And I would say, instead of saying, if Ukraine had kept that nuclear capability, would Russia have invaded? Instead, the question is, what would have happened to Ukraine if it insisted on keeping Soviet nuclear weapons? And essentially, there are a lot of assumptions that go into the idea that Ukraine could have kept and used those nuclear weapons. There's technical assumptions, there's diplomatic assumptions, and there's strategic assumptions. And the technical aspect is sort of the easiest to understand. Even though Ukraine had all of these warheads, it had no experience in or facilities for servicing and modernizing them. I mean, these weapons were brought in fully operational, and all the maintenance on them had to be carried out by Soviet scientists. So essentially, they hosted these weapons, but they had almost no capability of maintaining them or modernizing them, let alone having the codes to actually use them.
So you've told us about the technical issues there. What were some of the political and strategic considerations when it comes to could Ukraine have kept its nuclear weapons?
The political considerations are actually the most important, I think, because I believe, and other experts who have done research in this area, such as Stephen Pfeiffer, also argue that if Ukraine had tried to keep the Soviet nuclear weapons, Russia probably would have invaded much sooner. So Ukraine was safer and is safer without those nuclear weapons. And the reason for this is there's an assumption, a political assumption, when we hear the question, should Ukraine have kept those weapons? The assumption is that Russia would have let them do so. Moscow had no intention of letting Ukraine keep those inherited weapons. The first argument they made when the Soviet Union fell apart was that it would violate their NPT obligations not to transfer nuclear weapons to another state. And these were indeed Soviet weapons and Russian weapons because, as I mentioned, the Ukrainians had no facilities to maintain or modernize weapons. They were built in the Soviet Union and they were maintained by Soviet scientists. But there's a lot more to it than that, than just Russia's NPT obligations. Basically, Russia, especially because of the concerns about Crimea, Crimea was seen as, and still is today, part of the heartland of Russian Christianity, of sort of the Russian state. For example, Christianity came to the Russian Empire, to the Russian royalty in Crimea. And so it's actually seen as quite a holy place. And at the time, when the Soviet Union fell apart, Russia was doing all sorts of things to stop Ukraine from keeping its nuclear weapons. The idea that a state that had sort of this holy city of Russian Christianity could have nuclear weapons potentially to be used against Russia, it was just unbelievable. The Russians were threatening to shut down gas exports to Ukraine, and they actually did that several times temporarily. They threatened to permanently halt all gas supply until Kyiv met a number of demands, including the return of all nuclear weapons to Russia. And at the time, I know, Russia has invaded Crimea and taken it back. And of course, I absolutely think that was horrific. This is in no way an apology for that, but we have to understand back in 1994, Crimea was in a lot of ways Russian. For example, television that was broadcast in Crimea, almost none of it was in Ukrainian. It was almost all, about 90% in Russian. The Russian parliament tried to pass all sorts of edicts saying, returning Crimea to Russia. And in fact, Crimea was only transferred to Ukraine in 1954. I mean, it had been part of Russia, but it was transferred as part of a ceremony in 1954. So this was a really hot button topic for Russia. And the idea that the state of Ukraine, which had this really important component culturally and sort of emotionally to Russia, could keep these nuclear weapons that would separate the countries in this way, it wasn't going to happen. And in fact, there were commentators at the time saying it would just be better for Ukraine to return Crimea to Russia because there's going to be extreme instability here. The other political aspect that people don't realize is that the US would not have permitted Ukraine to keep its nuclear weapons, the Soviet nuclear weapons. The US had a number of non-proliferation goals it was trying to achieve, including new arms control agreement with Russia. But one of the Russian criteria for entering into this new arms control agreement was that Ukraine would give up the Soviet nuclear weapons. And so just think about it. Here's Ukraine. Let's imagine it was trying to keep those Soviet nuclear weapons. It would have to invest, the estimate was probably around $60 billion over 10 years for all the facilities, for all the training that it would need to be able to maintain and modernize both the nuclear weapons and the delivery vehicles. And if the Ukraine had stood up against the US and Europe, they wouldn't have gotten all of the foreign aid that they got from Europe and the US at the time, which was over $30 billion over several years. They also had a lot of human development concerns that they had to deal with. They had, education needs, health needs. Since its independence, Ukraine's GDP per capita has more than doubled. Poverty, inequality, child mortality have declined, maternal health outcomes, and access to education has improved. None of these things would have been possible if all of that money had gone instead into maintaining and modernizing a nuclear weapons program. And in fact, the president of Ukraine at the time, when the decision was being debated, said, we shouldn't have to give up our whole country just to keep these nuclear weapons. And that's essentially what would have happened. In addition to that, being able to develop this capacity to maintain and modernize the nuclear weapons and its delivery vehicles couldn't happen overnight. It would take about 10 years to build up all that capacity. And so you have about 10 years in which Ukraine is probably facing an unstable populace because they're not spending on human development needs. They're isolated from the West. They're probably having to go to black market supplies for important components to the nuclear weapons program, such as tritium. Tritium has a half-life of 12 years. And so they would have had to immediately been working on acquiring that. They couldn't have done it through legitimate channels, so they would have had to be going through black market channels and facing this significant Russian threat and potentially having their gas cut off. How would this have worked? It wouldn't have. And this is what I mean that it's a fantasy counterfactual.
It's a really interesting example of the cost of nuclear weapons and what you can achieve in other areas if you're not paying for nuclear weapons, like where spending could go if you're not spending all of that money on nuclear weapons.
Absolutely. And I think, even if you look at a country like Pakistan, they're spending more on their nuclear weapons program than they are on human health. And of course, we know that human health is the precursor to lots of other important human development goals. If you have a sickly population, then you're going to have issues with education, with human capital in your business sectors, industry sectors. Even in developed countries, if people really knew how much money was spent on the nuclear weapons complex, there might be a lot more people interested in curtailing that spending.
So tell me about the strategic aspect here.
People think that this idea of MAD, mutually assured destruction, works. And so if Ukraine had had nuclear weapons, it would be safe. And so if it had somehow managed to get through this 10-year period where it was isolated from the West, had domestic turmoil because of its spending, it wasn't spending in areas related to human development, and managed to somehow hold off the Russians. They'd somehow be safe. But the fact is we know that MAD actually doesn't work. There's lots of examples of nuclear weapon states engaging in conflict with each other. India and Pakistan are a great example. And in fact, Pakistan has felt enabled and encouraged to have conventional skirmishes with India because of its nuclear weapons program. And in fact, Pakistan in general has said nuclear weapons are our shield. And so nuclear weapons can actually promote conflict rather than diffuse it. And certainly in the case, given the powder keg that was Crimea, the concerns over Russian, this sort of holy city of Russian Christianity being kept by Ukraine, there's no way that the Russians would have let this just sit neatly.
So, Maria, you wrote about this 7 years ago after Crimea. Why do you think we still see so much misinformation on this subject? Is it simply misinformation or disinformation, or do you think this is a symptom of a broader challenge in nuclear weapons discourse?
This is absolutely the symptom of a broader problem in nuclear weapons discourse. These facts are not hard for people to get a hold of. I'm not a Ukrainian scholar. It was not hard for me to find this material, and other scholars have written about this as well as I. What are these broader problems? The first is that in nuclear armed states, people have been sold this pablum that nuclear weapons keep us safe from primary school, where students learn about the end of World War II. That World War II ended because the US used nuclear weapons and saved lots of lives. And of course, new research shows that's actually not the case at all. In fact, the Japanese were considering surrendering because they were concerned about the Soviet Union entering the war. And so when you've heard something over and over again, and of course, people fear nuclear weapons. And so it's sort of an emotional comfort but they keep us safe. John Mearsheimer is the biggest academic proponent of this argument, Ukraine should have kept its nuclear weapons. And he first made it back in the 1990s when the debate was actually happening. He spoke about it and wrote about it as well after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And of course, he's been very active making this argument now. And people want to hear John Mearsheimer repeating this same old refrain again and again because it matches with these emotional beliefs that they've been taught since primary school. And even when people are challenged, for example, John Mearsheimer knows well these arguments, not just from me, but from lots of other people. And yet he insists on repeating them because I think to an extent, first, it's his stick. And for academics, they have sticks, and giving them up and saying I was wrong is very difficult. But there's also emotional comfort for academics. I think there's another reason as well, and that is because of the lack of diversity in international security, in national security, in terms of the policymaking expertise, and in nuclear politics and sort of the nuclear industry as well. There's a problem in every area of academia that old white men are seen as the voices of wisdom, and voices that are coming from other places are seen as less credible. And so when you match this up, that nuclear weapons keep us safe, that's what we've heard for years. And the only people arguing against it seem to be voices that are not part of that, old white male clique, then it's very hard to have it break through. And this is the case, even though the arguments about the problems of Ukraine keeping those nuclear weapons are actually much more sensible and rooted in facts.
What does the Ukraine situation now tell us about the role of nuclear weapons and security more broadly?
What it tells us is that nuclear weapons do not keep us safe. The fact that just a few months ago, Putin agreed that nuclear weapons should never be used. And now here he is in a conflict saying, because of sanctions, I'm going to put my nuclear weapons on high alert. That tells us that nuclear use is much more likely than any of us care to think about. And so even though we would love for mutually assured destruction to work, because of course nobody wants a nuclear war that could lead to tremendous human and environmental destruction. So even though there's a certain emotional comfort to the idea that nuclear weapons will keep us safe. What we're seeing today in Ukraine right now shows us that if you have a leader who feels backed in the corner, he may indeed use nuclear weapons. And even if Putin doesn't use nuclear weapons, the fact that he's put them on this higher alert level, what that does in terms of the Russian nuclear weapons program is it allows for a physical signal to be transmitted so that a code can be transmitted and a launch can take place. And so there could be now accidental use. You would think of nuclear use, a country feels backed in the corner, it's facing existential threat where the physical security of its country, maybe it's facing a nuclear armed adversary that's about to launch nuclear weapons at it. That's not what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. Russia has tremendous financial sanctions, and yet they're now threatening a potential nuclear war over it. This is not the way that nuclear weapons theorists say it should happen, but this is the real world. We're out of the world of theory. And out of the world of theory, nuclear weapons make us less safe.
Maria Rost Rublee, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett and Angela Kelly, and in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing and Delphine Bridger, with research and assistance from Alex Hall, Harry Tarpey, and Desiree Zemeckis. Audio engineering and sound design by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.